take a look at really the Kobani situation and what that means for the region, and then sort of build it out from there. So I think, first of all, we should ask ourselves, why is Kobani important? It's a small town in northern Syria, about 35 kilometers north of Raqqa. It doesn't have that many in terms of natural resources. It doesn't have a huge population. It is not even the center of Rojava. It is not the center of the administration of Al-Shia. So why is it that this small Kurdish enclave, part of the 3 cantons which are being established in Syria by the Tebdem movement, or the PYD, if you like, by extension, why has this become so important, and what does that mean for not just Syria's Kurds, but Iraqi Kurds, and also Turkey as well, and what does it mean for US power in the region, because obviously we've seen quite a step up in terms of US commitments. So it was very clear, I think, that the media was able to cover Kobani in a way that perhaps we weren't able to do in Aleppo or Idlib or Deir ez-Zor, and perhaps with the exception of the Vice documentary that we saw in Raqqa, that was the only real look that we've had at the Islamic State, its operational methods, the kind of people that it employs. We've been able to see all sorts of things that we didn't know before about military movements, about how their supply lines work, about what kind of age the people they bring into the front, what do they look like? Because previously, of course, it had been a bit of an enigma. Now, one of the biggest problems here was that 2 of the parties very quickly realized this dynamic, and one of them didn't. And the 2 parties that realized, for very specific reasons, why this was an existential PR struggle as much as it was a strategic struggle, were because they were the ones doing the fighting. And that, of course, were the YPG, YPG forces, and the forces of the Islamic State. And the third player, of course, were the Turks, who only now have suddenly realized what a mess they've got themselves into, and what a bad situation it was for their foreign policy to have 15 tanks on a hill overlooking a situation which evoked memories of Sabra and Shatila, it evoked memories of a Stalingrad situation going on, and of course this created other problems with NATO allies and with strategists in the region that were looking and seeing Turkey in a black and white situation where the West had identified ISIS as a threat which it would degrade and destroy, along with a coalition of Arab partners and 30 other nations. The Turks stood back and did nothing. I think this is the key moment, is that a lot of people come to me and say, well, yes, what about Aleppo? What about Homs? What about Hama? Well, absolutely. You have every right to be frustrated about the lack of Western action in those parts of the country. But we have a qualitative shift now in that there is an alliance which is committed to the destruction of the Islamic State, which was not there before. And so those commitments that have come, and by extension the operations in Iraq, which then moved into Syria, have changed the playing field. Unfortunately, the Turks basically didn't understand this strategic shift and have been left behind, and as a result have allowed certain things to happen. The first thing that was allowed to happen was the emotional connection that suddenly much of the Middle East, including Arabs, not just Kurds, attached to the city of Kobani in a way that was far beyond its military strategic importance. It is strategically important. It's become incredibly strategically important because it is now, basically, as I said before, a Stalingrad moment, a place where the coalition of Western and Arab states have drawn a line and said the Islamic State will no longer progress beyond this point. And in the middle of that were the YPG, who were seen as the front line of this particular operation. On the other side, of course, you had the Islamic State. The last thing that they wanted to appear was like they were being put on the back foot. So what we had initially in the opening stages of the conflict were limited airstrikes by the coalition around Raqqa, which moved ISIS forces northwards towards Kobani, which then reignited a conflict which had actually been raging in early July. And it's interesting, of course, that the amount of coverage on the attack of Kobani in July, most people won't remember, because it wasn't really there. And now, of course, we have a completely different situation which has changed the game. Again, the qualitative shift is the operations of the coalition shifted into Syria, the stakes became higher. On the edge of this stood the Turks, who didn't seem to understand the qualitative shift and the emotional shift that was going on, whereby the PYD went from a group that was seen as an ally of the PKK, a slightly distasteful Kurdish group, if you like, in Western circles, that has the label of terrorism attached to it. They've gone from being an organization, if you like, where diplomats would struggle to meet them in this country and would only meet them in Brussels, to all of a sudden entertaining Western and European strategists, major military operators in the region, and all of a sudden what we have is an express commitment by the United States to the security of Syria and Kurdistan. Now, I would have said a year ago, you would never have thought that that particular position would have come about. The de facto movement of Rojava to autonomy, if you like, was done because of the collapse of Syria beneath it. The Islamic State had yet to fully rise. Of course, there were some allegations that the regime of Bashar al-Assad was also helping the PYD in that endeavor. But it hadn't really concretized that as a de facto autonomous region. It was simply an experiment which may work, but again, like perhaps the Farouk Brigade, which had 25,000 fighters, which stretched from the northern border of Bab al-Salama all the way down to the outskirts of Damascus, it could have failed. There was plenty of money going to the Farouk Brigades, plenty more supplies going to the Farouk Brigades. Why did they not last? Yet, all of a sudden, what we have now is an express commitment by the United States to support the PYD, or the Tevdem movement, in its administration of the three cantons. So this has brought us to Syrian Kurdistan's 1991 movement, where Western military force has, in effect, carved out a de facto region for Kurdish political action, which was not there before. Now, qualitatively, we can argue about the differences between what the KRG has become and what the PYD and the Tevdem movement are doing in Syria, which are very different. Ideologically, they do not look the same. But at the same time, what you have is very clearly a movement towards an autonomous region, which is not particularly interested in dealing with the Jaish al-Hor, or the Free Syrian Army, and it's certainly not that interested in moving towards a collective Damascus agreement whereby they will accept some kind of reduction of their newly found autonomous strength. Yeah. So what we have is now the Americans creating this bracket of security whereby Rojava is able to come to fruition. How does this then link in with the KRG? Well, of course, we had the Doha agreement, which was concluded this week. I'm actually more hopeful than Bill is. I think that my PYD contacts were quite glowing about Barzani and about the fact that he has moved towards what he sees as understanding their position. The agreement which has been struck has split 40-40 the seats in the Democratic administration of Rojava between the EKNS, or the KNC, Kurdish National Council, and the PYD-affiliated parties of the Tevdem movement, and given 6 seats, or 20%, to other groupings. Now, at the moment, it's a very, very fragile coalition, but it is holding. Whether the Peshmerga will then go into Kobani to solidify this in a security, not only political fashion, remains to be seen. But what we have for now is an agreement which holds. And this is something which is looking better than Hawler 1 or Hawler 2, the two previous political agreements in which there was no real security foundation at all. Now we actually have that, and it's being discussed. So I actually think that it's a step forward. I think that ultimately what we will see is more cooperation on the security sphere, because the threat of ISIS is so severe that it seems both Erbil and Kavishlo have understood that dynamic. And that is something that Turkey has not understood, is that in that vacuum that left by leaving its tanks on top of the hill outside Kobani, it allowed the two Kurdish movements to come together. It is trying to insert itself back into the process, whereby the Peshmerga will be coming through Turkish territory. But this is a very, very small lever in comparison to what the Turks had even 2 weeks ago. So what we have to understand is that there is a qualitative shift in the nature of Turkish power on Kurdish politics. The more that Barzani and Saleh Muslim are able to cooperate together, the less the Turks are able to play in the game. So I think what we have now is this bracket of US power which is creating new realities on the ground, and unfortunately for the Turks, they've been left out of the process.